Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to indeed share this last session, which before we go to the presentation by John, will be opened up by Klaus Regling, the Managing Director of the ESM. I mean, we are happy to co-organize this event, also to celebrate the ESM anniversary. And so Klaus will talk to us also on our perspective on EMU and on our university. So please, Klaus, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks, Rolf. And I'm happy to join a very small part of your workshop. You are talking for 2.5 days about a dynamic economic and monetary union. And I think that is a good topic, and a topic that has been with us and will be with us for a long time. And you are having this discussion in a very special week. And today on a very special day, because it's today the 50th anniversary of the Werner Report. And as you know, the Luxembourg Prime Minister at the time, Pierre Werner, in his report that was published on the 8th of October 1970, developed a vision of how a common European currency could be reached in several stages. I have always found this topic fascinating. For instance, I did my master's thesis 3 years after the Werner Report, so in 1973, on the theory of optimum currency areas, with a particular emphasis on Europe. And somehow the topic has never left me. In addition, and that's why I say it's a special week or a special day, today on the 8th of October, we also have the 8th anniversary of the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism. And of course, there's a close connection between the Werner Report and the ESM. In his report, Pierre Werner advocated a European integration in stages. And I think it's fair to say that the creation of the ESM, a lender of last resort for states, which didn't exist at the beginning of monetary union, was another important stage in the deepening of EMU. And it's also another example how European countries do come together in difficult times when there are special challenges and come up occasionally with very innovative solutions. The importance of European integration was never more apparent than during this pandemic. Collective action led to the rapid creation of several EU safety nets earlier this year, which help lessen the burden of this economic, financial, and social catastrophe for member states. And it's important to understand that all these safety nets, and I will talk about them in a moment, were deliberately designed in a way that countries most affected by COVID-19 benefit most from these safety nets. This is an unprecedented degree of solidarity among European countries, and it's in the self-interest of every European country because this is a way to protect the single market and to avoid excessive divergences in the euro area. Each of these safety nets that were agreed by finance ministers in May has a different purpose. The ESM's pandemic crisis tool supports countries to cover the increase in their healthcare-related cost. SURE is a backstop for workers managed by the European Commission, while the EIB's Guarantee Fund helps businesses. And of course, the European Central Bank contained financial fragmentation and continues to contain financial fragmentation by significantly expanding its asset purchase program. This has helped calm financial markets and lowered sovereign borrowing cost, providing fiscal space for sizable national fiscal measures in response to the COVID-19 problems. The policy response we have seen in response to COVID-19 is substantially larger than what happened during the global financial crisis in 2008 and 9. And I think this is really appropriate, given that this crisis is very different from any other crisis in living memory and much deeper. At the same time, we will need to ensure the efficient use and implementation of the unprecedented amounts of public money made available. We cannot solely rely on accommodative monetary policy and the resulting low interest rates. Instead, member states must take steps. They must invest and reform to raise their economic growth potential. The Next Generation EU Recovery Fund from the European Commission can help strengthen the resilience and competitiveness of European economies. But appropriate reforms need to accompany support from the Recovery Fund. At the ESM, we have seen firsthand how successful reforms can be. Agreed upon reforms tied to our loan disbursements through conditionality have helped our 5 borrowing member states regain competitiveness and market access during the period 2011 to 18. And all the economies were stronger after that experience, after they implemented the ESM programs. Today's crisis, of course, is very different from the Euro crisis. Today's crisis was caused by a symmetric shock, while the Euro crisis was caused by significant macroeconomic imbalances and policy mistakes. And that is why the ESM today can make money available without conditionality. At the conference today, you discuss a number of issues in our economic and monetary union that are important and require attention. Tomorrow, we will hear several more. Your work continues a long tradition that started with the Werner report. It is clear that we must continue our work and further ADEMU by completing the ESM reform, for example, to ensure financial stability in the euro area, by completing banking union with a common backstop and a common deposit insurance, by creating a capital markets union to harmonize all 27 national financial markets, by designing a fiscal capacity for macroeconomic stabilization, which is very controversial still among our member states, and by increasing the volume of safe euro assets. Some of these items on our agenda are controversial, as I said, among our member states, particularly the common deposit insurance and a fiscal capacity for macroeconomic stabilization. So it will take a while before all items on this agenda can be completed. But your continued support and advice on these items will be needed for many years to come. But progress on all these items will lead to a more integrated Europe and a better functioning monetary union.
I'm just about to give a big public lecture.
As they would complete the process that began with the Werner report 50 years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Klaus. I think good to have your account of the crisis response. And I think also good to hear that indeed the academic advice and the academic research that is done here and that is discussed is indeed very helpful. Now, without further ado, let me turn to John Moore, who will, I understand, based on a joint paper with Nobuhiro Kiyotaki and Jen-Tsing Chang, talk about credit horizons, about firm behavior, interest rates, and what that means for the growth of our economy. John, we are very much looking forward to your keynote speech, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I just check, can everybody see my overheads?
Yes, we see them.
Very good, thank you. So as you say, this is joint work with Nobu Kiyotaki and Shenxing Zhang. Nobu actually is online, I believe, at the moment. Shenxing regrettably couldn't make it. The title of the talk, Credit Horizons, is born of this question. To finance long-term investment, entrepreneurs raise external funds against broadly two kinds of security. One is collateral, and the other is future cash flow, future revenues. And there's an extremely helpful recent paper by Lian and Ma, which is coming out in the QJE, may have already come out, called The Anatomy of Corporate Borrowing Constraints, which analyzes US data and comes to the conclusion that among established firms, much of the borrowing, around 80%, is against future revenues, against cash flows, and only 20% is against collateral constraints. Now, of the 80%, a typical covenant would say that they cannot borrow more than, say, somewhere between 3 and 4.5 times annual revenues. And I'm going to use that as a stepping off point to conclude that, first of all, that's quite a low number. It certainly doesn't reflect the net present value of future cash flows. And second, it's rather a kind of fixed number. I mean, it's not necessarily binding. There may be episodes when firms go above the 4.5, but they're fairly soon brought back to heel. Now, what this means, or we take this to mean, is that when entrepreneurs borrow against future revenues, they borrow against the near-term revenues. Let's say between 3 and 4.5 years worth. Even though the investment itself may be long-term, with associated long-term fixed costs, per period fixed costs, and also with the anticipation of long-term revenue streams. So the question is, why are these credit horizons, as we call them, largely near-term? Why do firms borrow against their near-term revenues? And we hope to put forward an answer to that question and use it to explore two kinds of issue. One is the question of the evolution of firm or plant dynamics and productivities at the individual plant level. And the other issue is an issue which has certainly been topical in Japan for 2 or 3 decades and is becoming increasingly topical around the world, which is, why is it that low interest rates don't seem to stimulate growth? Could it be, in fact, that low interest rates might stifle investment and growth? So in order to give just a feeling of what I'm going to be arriving at later on, take a look, please, at this stylistic equation where we have gross investment on the left-hand side. And in a world of borrowing constraints, this is a very typical equation. In the numerator of the right-hand side, you have the savings rate times the net worth of the entrepreneurs who are credit constrained, who are doing the borrowing, divided by the required down payment per unit of investment, which is the gross investment cost minus whatever they can lever, whatever they can borrow. Let's call that the borrowing capacity. Now, much of the literature is focused on the numerator of this right-hand side. Work which I've done with Nobu, much of the work I've done with Nobu Kiyotaki has been about that. Today's talk is more about the denominator, and in particular about why it might be the case that borrowing capacity might fall as interest rates fall. The logic being that if you're borrowing against the near-term horizon, among other things, to pay for costs which are long-term, then a fall in the interest rate could cause the cost, your cost side, to go up proportionately more than the present value of these near-term revenues. So if you think about it, if this borrowing capacity were to fall in response to a fall in the interest rates, then that raises the denominator and suppresses investment. And that's the genesis of an argument, which I'll be coming to later in the talk, to say that low interest rates may actually stifle investment and growth. In fact, this equation, this ratio of the numerator divided by the denominator, I was kind of keen on calling the title of our talk, instead of calling it Credit Horizons, I was keen on calling it The Denominator, in honor of Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Terminator. Now, I don't have much time, so I'm going to go to the model. It's a small open economy with an exogenous world interest rate, capital R. So the net interest rate is like R minus 1. We're going to have no aggregate uncertainty, but later we'll introduce a so-called MIT shock where there's a sudden, an unanticipated persistent drop in R. A single good, which is going to double up, it's perishable, and it's going to double up as investment and consumption good. And in this open economy, there's going to be a continuum of domestic agents, each of whom maximizes the discounted utility, where beta here is the discount factor, of the logarithm of consumption. Now, each of these domestic agents sometimes has an investment opportunity. And I'm going to call that class or that subclass of agents engineers or entrepreneurs. And the others who don't have the opportunity, let's call them savers. And at the individual level, there's a Markov process determining which category any one agent is in, and there's persistence. So if I was an engineer yesterday, pi e, the probability at which I'm an engineer still today, let's think of that as being greater than a half. If I, on the other hand, was a saver yesterday, then pi s, the probability that I switch and become an engineer today, let's think of that as being less than a half. Now, can I focus on a particular engineer, E, let's call her Emma, E for Emma, and at each date, being an engineer, this is what it means to be an engineer, Emma can jointly produce two things from goods. So this is a constant returns to scale technology. It's, if you like, the ex ante technology, where at the beginning of the period, if she puts in X goods, at the end of the period comes out two things: plant, and I'm going to talk about the quality of plant and the evolution of the quality of plant a lot. Quality could also be reinterpreted as productivity. And anyway, we normalize the initial productivity or quality to be 1. The other half of the joint product in 1-to-1 ratio is what we call a tool, and it's specific to Emma. So let's call it an E tool. And tools, let me say right now, are a metaphor for human capital capacity. So we're borrowing from an idea of arrows, that of learning by doing through not so much production as we customarily think of it, but through gross investment. So the tool is Emma learning by investment. And these two outputs are ready for use from the next day. Now, Emma raises funds to finance this constant returns to scale investment. Let me say now, in the equilibrium we're interested in, it's going to be a strictly productive activity, so with a return of greater than capital R. So she's going to be constrained in the scale of that investment by, among other things, her net worth, and also what she can raise against the output. Now she can, we assume, sell, that is to say, completely mortgage the plant. And who does she sell that? Who does she raise funds from? The savers. So at this ex ante moment, she raises funds by selling the plant to savers. Now, in an Arrow-Debreu framework, she would in principle be able to also raise funds against her own human capital because a promise is honored. But crucially, we're going to depart from Arrow-Debreu once, here it is, and assume that she cannot commit her own human capital, her future human capital. Now, each tool is specific to her. So each of these tools, well, each tool is specific to the engineer in question. In this case, we're talking about Emma. So it's an Emma tool, an E tool, in the sense that only she knows how to use it. If she were to, by the way, migrate across to becoming a saver later on, then she would in principle could sell the tool to another entrepreneur and teach that other entrepreneur how to use it. But critically, the tool is specific to her. Remember, a tool is a unit of capacity. So if she had two tools, she'd have double the unit of capacity. Now she sells the plant, as I say, she mortgages what she can, which is the plant, by selling it to someone who's a saver, let's say me. And as the new owner of the plant, of quality Z, so in general, through time, the quality will move, and although Z starts off being equal to 1, it will adjust. And I'm actually, as the owner of the plant, able to choose that evolution of quality. How do I do that? Well, I hire tools together with the entrepreneur who knows how to use them in a competitive market. So the quantity of tools, that is to say, the number of the quantity of engineering services that I input is my choice, but I have to pay for it, of course. And we have an ex post competitive market for tools or for engineering services, a rental price for tools, if you like, and we call this the wage, W. Let me say right now that the wage, please don't think of the wage as a wage for unskilled workers. This is an internal wage to be transferred to the deep insider, or a deep insider, the engineer. So it's payment to inside owners, in a sense. I'm the outside owner. Now, what do I do? What's my ex post technology? Well, the point of owning plant is to produce goods, and I can also choose to maintain plant quality. So within the period, per unit of plant, I have again the constant returns to scale technology, where if I put in if I have 1 unit of plant of quality Z, and I hire H tools, and H is my choice, I also incidentally have to pay a fixed cost, F goods, and we have in mind here that there might be, say, a building that this is all happening inside, and I have to pay either the rent on the building, or if I own the building, then F is the opportunity cost, the user cost of the building. Getting out, I yields Y goods, which is a multiple of the quality. So as I said earlier, you could also think of quality as productivity. So A times Z is the outputs. Notice we've taken a special case here where the tools, the H tools, don't impact on the immediate output. But what they do impact is tomorrow's quality. So if Z prime, today's Thursday, isn't it? So tomorrow's, Friday's quality, Z prime, is going to be a function, a mapping from the current Thursday quality Z and the number of tools that I choose to hire through this little Cobb-Douglas production function. This actually plays a this is center stage in the analysis. So the exponents, respectively, theta and eta, may or may not add up to 1, the constant return scale. would be where they do add up to 1. If they don't add up to 1, you could think of that as the contribution from the building. Now, in use, both plant and tools depreciate with probably 1 minus lambda. Let's say they cease to be useful. And so a fraction lambda of the plant and a fraction lambda h of the tools will continue to be valuable through till tomorrow. Please let me emphasize the tools here belong not to me as the plant owner, but to Emma. So Emma and people like Emma who I hire enter today, Thursday, with H tools. I pay them W per tool, and they leave today with a slightly smaller number of tools. Now, you might ask, well, where did those tools come from? Answer: from Emma's ex-ante investments. It's through investment that she augments the number of tools that she has. This technology here, it's sort of, we think of it as being inspired by the Austrian school of Bomberweg, and it's a kind of roundabout technology that deep down, it's the engineers, the tools input, which creates the quality, which creates the output. But it takes time. It kind of worms its way through time. The immediate output comes from the immediate level of quality. If, on the other hand, I want to sustain the quality, sustain the productivity, I have to hire more engineers, more tools, and that's this little production function. And so hiring tools today has an impact on tomorrow's output, Friday's output, but it also has an impact on Saturdays and Sundays and so on. And that's the sense in which it's a roundabout technology. Now, as the plant owner, I always have the option to stop, because remember, I'm paying these fixed costs. And if they don't get covered, then I'm just wasting money. And there's a little Bellman equation here, nothing on the face of it too difficult, where I define capital V to be the end of Thursday net present value to me of a unit of plant. Remember, everything's constant with reference to scale. So as a saver, I have possibly several plants on my books in my portfolio. Taking one of the units of it, which happens, let's say, to have quality Z, the present value of that to me will be the discounted value of, well, 0 if I choose to shut down tonight on Thursday night, or if I go through to Friday, well, then I'm going to get the flow gross return, the revenues, AZ. And then I've got to pay the fixed costs. Without that, I don't get any revenue. And also, I may or may not choose to hire engineers, tools to boost quality. Per unit, it costs me W. And the point of it would be to push up Z prime, which will be Saturday's quality. And sorry, Friday night's quality, let's put it that way. And then the value function applies to the evening's value of quality, tomorrow night's value of quality. Although this is actually very simple to write down, it turns out it has some subtleties, at least it was subtle to us. It turns out that my problem, the biggest level question which I have to ask myself is, am I in this for the long haul or not? Should I continue forever, as we call it? I mean, that's modulo depreciation, remember? Or should I plan to stop after a finite number of periods, T? So I'm inheriting or starting with a particular quality level. If I want to maintain that quality level, it's going to cost me. And the question is, should I or shouldn't I bother? Well, to answer that question, it's useful to define these sort of auxiliary value functions. So S0 is the value of stopping tonight, which is clearly 0. S1 would be the value of stopping tomorrow night. Now, if I'm going to stop tomorrow night on Friday night, then I'm going to get the revenue tomorrow, Friday, AZ, minus those fixed costs. But of course, I won't choose to hire any engineers on Friday because there would be no point. Why would I hire engineers on Friday to boost Saturday's quality if I'm planning to shut down on Friday night? S2 would be the value function associated with planning to shut down on Saturday night, in which case I've got the Friday return, now net of whatever engineers tools I choose to hire, which boosts the Saturday quality and therefore the Saturday revenue, minus those fixed costs on Saturday, suitably depreciated back to Friday by lambda over R, and in that in turn discounted back to today, Thursday night. If I choose to stop in capital T periods time, well, then there's a sort of inductive formula here, connecting ST to ST minus 1. And the value function that I defined on the previous slide, capital V, is the supremum of all these S's. And it turns out that there's an interesting dichotomy between stopping after a finite number of periods on the one hand and continuing forever. Now, there's a large literature, of course, on the evolution of plants and the exit of plants. Typically, that literature has firms or plants exiting in the here and now, whereas what I'm talking about is something more subtle where I plan to exit in whatever, let's say 20 periods time. And I milk the current quality, possibly letting it depreciate during those 20 periods with a view to getting out in 20 periods. Now, the question is, should I do that or should I simply plan to stay forever? It depends on my current quality. And there's a cutoff level, Z dagger, we call it, above which I will choose to stay forever and below which I will get out. Now, there's a nice diagram to capture this. I think I've made my slides slightly too big here. So on the horizontal axis, I've got the current quality Z. And on the vertical axis, or each of these lines constitutes the value function. Now, capital V is the upper envelope of these various value functions. The thick black value function, S infinity, is the value function associated with staying in forever. And notice that to the right of Z dagger, the critical level, the top dog is S infinity, staying in forever. However, to the left of Z dagger, there are a number of colored lines here, each of which corresponds to a different stopping time. And in particular, S20, given the parameter values we've chosen to draw the diagram, S20 is at exactly the same height as S infinity at Z dagger, which in plain English is saying that I would be indifferent between, on the one hand, choosing to stay forever, and on the other hand, choosing to get out after 20 periods. Now, if my current quality Z dagger is less than that, I will get out sooner. So the highest, you can't quite see it, but the highest colored line might be, I don't know, S15, which would be getting out in 15 periods time. And as my current quality gets lower and lower, I get out sooner and sooner. There's less inherited quality or existing quality to milk. Of course, if the existing quality is below F over A, remember F, the fixed cost, and A, the per unit of quality return, if that is less than F over an A, then I should get out right now, tonight, on Thursday night. So the highest value of V is simply 0, way there to the left. One more thing I want to just extract from this diagram are these rather strange looking arrows here. So these red arrows in particular constitute the sequence of my optimal choices of Z through time. So there are 20 of those were I to start at Z dagger. In other words, I'm starting with this critical level, let's say, of Z dagger, and choosing to slowly allow the quality of my plant to drop through time, taking 20 periods to do so, spending presumably not much, or not too much, certainly towards the end, on tool hire, and then getting out after 20 periods. The other, to repeat, I think what I said a few minutes ago, if I were to start somewhere in the middle, then there would only be, let's say, 15 of these arrows before I get out. If, on the other hand, I decide to stay in, again, let's say I was starting at the critical value of Z dagger, then what I would do is choose to invest more heavily. In fact, invest heavily in tools. And these are actually drawn every 10 green arrows. So this process happens rather slowly. And I would asymptote to some higher level of quality Z star. That's for the case where we don't have constant returns. With constant returns to scale, this thing would go off to infinity. So this is a very interesting dichotomy. And at Z dagger, it turns out I'm absolutely indifferent between those two radically different policies. Now, another way of seeing that is on the left here, on these, I wish I had not made my slides quite so big. Maybe I could make them smaller right now. Forgive me. Can I ask you, is that still visible? Could someone say yes or no?
It's well visible for me, yes.
Thank you, thank you. Actually, it's still not fitting quite on the plot. But anyway, so on these two horizontal axes, I've got real time, T. The left-hand diagram represents my stopping strategy, and it sort of captures, I think, what I was talking about before, namely, if I were to start, let's say, at the critical value of quality Z dagger, then over the 20 periods that I choose to stay in, I slowly allow quality to drop. I hire fewer and fewer tools or engineers, rent fewer tools, and then get out. Whereas if I choose the continuing strategy, I invest much more heavily in tools and allow my quality to asymptote up to, or choose my quality to asymptote up to S star. And the division of surplus between me and the engineers that I hire is rather straightforward. If the height of this graph is gross revenue per period, then the blue portion represents that which I'm paying today at any given moment to the engineers that I'm currently hiring. And the residual gray portion is what's left for me. So remember, I'm choosing a sequence of H's which yields a sequence of Z's which yields this flow or path of revenues. And then the split of revenues is the blue-gray split. Now, this split, although sort of it conforms with our normal understanding of cash flow, the division of cash flow, isn't as economically interesting as another way of looking at it. So one thing we need to perhaps roll up our sleeves to get inside is the determination of the wage. Because of the roundaboutness of the technology, the marginal product of a tool that I hire at any given moment is obviously, in the first instance, the impact of that on tomorrow's quality through the exponent of H in the little Cobb-Douglas production function, which is eta. But that's not all. Tomorrow's quality through the other half of the Cobb-Douglas production function, tomorrow's quality will affect, through the exponent theta, the day after tomorrow's quality, which in turn yields output, and so forth. So putting this perhaps more adroitly, we can say that the amount of cash or wage bill that I pay to engineers today is a slice or a bite of tomorrow's cherry. So think of YT plus 1 as tomorrow's output, YT plus 2 as the next day's, etc. Then what I effectively am doing is paying the people I hire today a bite eta of tomorrow's cherry, suitably discounted, the cherry being suitably discounted, I should say, and then a bite eta times theta of the day after tomorrow's cherry, and so on. So the wage at any given moment, because of the roundaboutness of the technology, is a forward-looking, a discounted value of future productivities. And that spawns this different way of cutting the cake. This is the same upper lines reflecting the two strategies, stopping versus continuing. On the left, stopping. But now the blue area is the fraction. Let's start over here. So if I take a particular height of gross revenue and ask what fraction of that revenue, so this is some period's time, looking to the future, what fraction of that revenue can be meaningfully apportioned to the cumulative input of tools or engineering services that I've hired over the intervening years or periods? Well, I gave the game away just now that there's a lot of inputting of engineering services between now and then, and therefore the blue share, looked at it through that lens, is considerably taller than what's left for me. And actually, in the case, the most interesting way to see this is that in the case of constant returns to scale, where theta plus eta adds up to 1, my share of the gross revenue would asymptote to 0. And we've drawn this for the case where, what have we got here? Theta is 0.9 and eta is 0.09. So they don't quite add up to 1. And so my share doesn't quite asymptote to 0. But the broad brush conclusion is that as time goes by, more and more of the share of a bigger and bigger share of the revenue is really, or has already been paid to engineers, and less of it is mine. Now, the relevance of all this is that when I initially, at that ex-ante stage, purchase from Emma a unit of plant of quality 1, I will be looking at the PDV, the present discounted value of this gray area. Actually, to be very precise, I should be looking at the present discounted value of that gray area net of the fixed costs. So this, I deliberately drew this blue-gray diagram, omitting to talk about fixed costs. But if I net in fixed costs, then I look at the present discounted value of this. Now, what's really interesting here is that it has positive regions and negative regions. So viewed from the moment at which I initially buy the plant from Emma, I'm looking ahead to a stream of returns which are initially positive, but turn negative. We can see that in some algebra here, which is what we call the borrowing capacity is the value of the plant, how much I'm willing to pay for a unit of plant of quality 1, initial quality 1. Well, the answer is, well, if I buy it today, then I'll get the full Friday cake, and then the full Saturday cake, but minus the bit that I have to pay to Emma, or people like Emma, and then on Sunday, it's the full Sunday cake, but minus 2 bites of the cherry, the bit that I pay to engineers on Sunday, and the bits that I paid to engineers on Saturday in anticipation of the Sunday, and so on. And eventually these square brackets turn negative. You might think, well, why would I not simply shut down? Let's look at this left-hand case where about 11, it seems that I turn negative. Why don't I shut down at 11? Well, the answer is because by then, the costs that I've paid on maintaining my plant to date, that is in those first 10 periods, are sunk. Looking forward, it's still rational for me to continue. But viewed through date 1 at the point at which I bought the initial plant, that last part of the tail is negative. Now, what that means is that the effect of interest rates on borrowing capacity can be nicely and interestingly ambiguous, because a fall in the interest rates, bearing in mind that these tail terms may be negative, a fall in the interest rates could reduce the borrowing constraint. And that is suggestive of where I was, what I said at the beginning, that low interest rate regimes may be bad for investment. Now, the rest of the analysis, in a way, is straightforward if you're familiar with these kind of financial macro models. A typical budget constraint can be written in two ways. One is consumption plus investment, where investment is the gross cost of investment X minus the borrowing capacity B that I've just given you the formula for. I put this in blue because it's the denominator. This is Arnold Schwarzenegger. Okay, we're going to see it again and again. Plus, if I am a saver, I will have financial assets. They could be either ownership of plant or possibly foreign bonds. And then how do I pay for it? That's right, that's my purchases. How do I pay for it? Well, through wage income or the dividends and capital values of foreign bonds. A perhaps more interesting way to write that same equation is in stock terms. So I've got consumption plus the value of my end of period holdings of tools, if I'm an engineer, end of period value of all financial assets, including plant. How do I pay for all that? I pay for it by the value of tools, where now it's not simply the wage, but it's also the replacement value of tools. Again, X minus B creeps in here, and plus any financial assets I might have. So this right-hand side is what we call net worth. And then the return on levered investment is the W plus the same square bracket here on in the top line divided by X minus B, the unit cost of levered investment on the bottom line. And in the interesting equilibrium, that will exceed R, which is indicative of credit constraints. Consumption, because of the logarithm, is a simple fraction of net worth, and investment is the residual fraction of net worth times by the deposit. So if you imagine dividing that last equation by X minus B, you would rediscover the equation the stylized equation I had at the very beginning, where we had the savings rate times net worth divided by the cost of investment minus the borrowing capacity. So we're looking for a steady state equilibrium. The market clearing price is W, and if you like, B. Aggregation is very straightforward because of the fact that all the behavioral equations happen to be linear. So although that down at the individual level, there's a lot of heterogeneity because everyone has their own idiosyncratic history of being either a saver or an entrepreneur, an engineer. It doesn't matter for the purposes of aggregation. It's an endogenous growth model here, where the growth rate is going to be determined by the deep parameters of the model. Now, there's an interesting split in the parameter space. The parameter space roughly divides into two. One is where there's no stopping. We call this the P region, or the pure equilibrium. And this is associated with low values of F, the fixed cost. Now, in this case, Z dagger, which is this endogenously determined point at which I'm indifferent as a plant owner between stopping and continuing forever, Z dagger is less than 1, meaning that nobody ever goes near there. All of us plant owners are very happy to continue forever. Because there's no exit of plant owners, and remember that the entry is 1-to-1 between plant and tools, and the depreciation rate was chosen to be equal. That means that in this, if you like, the market for engineering services is in 1-to-1 ratio of quantities. So H at the individual level, HT will be equal to 1. And if HT is equal to 1, then ZT will stay equal to the initial level. So ZT is equal to Z star, the asymptotic level, which is equal to 1. The other case is where the fixed cost is higher. Now, we think this is pretty interesting, actually, which is where plant owners, initial plant owners, whose, remember, their Z quality level is equal to 1, are precisely indifferent between stopping and continuing forever. That is, mathematically, Z dagger precisely equals 1. And it's like a mixed strategy equilibrium where some of the plant owners say, well, I'm going to get out, maybe after 20 periods, let's say, and the rest of them, people like me, stay in for the long haul. Because there's exit, the ratio of tools to plant is larger than 1. And so there are enough tools in the marketplace to allow the stayers to increase in quality. And with constant returns to stale, their quality asymptotes to Z star, as I described earlier. With decreasing returns, it asymptotes to some finite Z star. With constant returns to scale, the quality would endlessly grow at some rate, little g, but not to be confused with the aggregate growth rate, incidentally. But of course, there's depreciation happening. Meantime, the levers stop just before ZT falls below F over A. Now, in terms of quality, characteristics of equilibrium, for an open set of parameters, a pure equilibrium exists such that an unexpected permanent drop in the interest rate, so this is the MIT shock that I promised much earlier, leads to a lower steady state growth rate. So this is lower interest rates, paradoxically stifling investment. And actually, it's even more dramatic than that we show numerically it's possible for all agents to be worse off when the interest rate falls permanently. It's pretty clear that savers would be worse off if the interest rate falls, but it's also, and this is the exciting, unusual part here, is the engineers can also be worse off. Why? Because their borrowing capacities, the Bs, are reduced, are stifled. The intuition for that is as follows, that in one of these P region equilibria, no one's leaving. So HT is 1 all the time. ZT stays at the initial level of 1. YT is simply A. So when you look at the borrowing capacity, that's the amount that I'm willing to pay for 1 unit of plant with initial quality 1, knowing it's going to stay in equilibrium at 1. Well, then I'm really looking at this net flow on the top line here, which is return A per unit minus the wage rate. That's W times H, but H is 1, minus the fixed costs. Depreciated Y by R minus lambda. Why? Because there's the depreciation of lambda and the interest rate R, which I use. Now, in this equation, which is very straightforward, of course, what's less straightforward is that the wage rate itself is a function of R. So this is my, bites of the cherry, the cake formula at work. And notice that the wage rate rises significantly with the fall in R. So that's an important stepping stone in the intuition, that when the interest rate is lower, bearing in mind that marginal productivity is a discounted sum, wages will be higher. And wages being higher reduces B. So a fall in R pushes B up for the usual reasons that borrowers like lower interest rates. But on the other hand, a fall in R raises what we call the wage rate, but it's the share of the engineers. And that sorry, I think I said that the wrong way around. A fall in R raises the wage rate, and that depresses the top line of this formula, and that can overwhelm the bottom line. In particular, if we look at the constant return scale, then we get this quite neat looking formula for B, where we have the present value of the plant owner's share of gross revenues. So no great surprise here, it's A on the top line over R minus lambda theta. Why lambda theta? Because theta is this endlessly increasing bites of the cherry. Sorry, I didn't put that properly. This R minus lambda theta formula pops out when you substitute the wage into the initial formula for B. But let's put it another way. because theta is less than 1, just think about it mathematically, the impact of a fall in interest rates on the first term is not that great compared with the impact of a fall of interest rates on the costs, on the fixed costs, which don't have theta sitting there and do not depreciate in that way. In English, what's this saying is that the value of the committable cash flows, so this comes back to the title of the talk, that the committable, the pledgeable cash flows are near term, and they, of course, will go up when the interest rate falls, but they won't go up as much proportionately as the costs. So if these are buildings, the price of the buildings that we have to pay for when we make new investment in response to falls in interest rate can go through the roof, much more so than the extent to which cash flows sustain borrowing. And the difference between the two is borrowing capacity. And this is my earlier equation, that gross investment is the savings rate, beta, times the net worth of engineers, divided by the blue, X minus B. Now, if the borrowing capacity falls when the interest rate falls, that obviously raises this denominator, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and depresses investment. And that effect, which is new, more than offsets any potential, well, in fact, there will be an increase in net worth associated with the engineers, in part coming from the fact that wages have gone up. Their wage, please again, don't confuse these wages with blue collar wages. We might have been better off not calling them wages. It's true that a fall in interest rates pushes W up. That's the starting point of my intuition. A fall in the interest rates pushes W up, which pushes up the net worth, but that isn't powerful enough to offset the fact that the borrowing can, or it can be, I shouldn't say that this is not always the case. Part of the parameter space has this property that can be more than offset by the depression in the borrowing capacity. In the mixed equilibrium, we have fewer analytical things to say, but we've run some simulations. And actually, this is a graph which captures both cases. For R, remember, is the sort of exogenous driver here. So for R being anything above 1.5%, up to 3 here, we're in what's called the P region. So there's no exiting. And as I promised, because of the fact that when R falls, the borrowing capacity falls, the growth rate can fall. Why? Because as R falls, the wage rate rises. To the left of 1.015, the economy slips into the M region. I mean, you can see that in this left-hand diagram here, where to the left of 1.015, Z dagger hits 1, which is a telltale sign of the fact that the people like me who buy initial plant of quality 1 play a mixed strategy between exiting and staying for the long haul. Remember, Z dagger being equal to 1 is putting that into maths. And further to the left, the further we go down with interest rates, the higher the ultimate asymptotic level of quality. Over here in the middle, we've got the stopping time for the people who choose to stop. And over here, we've got the stopping fraction. So apparently, according to this diagram, as R drops, more and more of those initial plant owners choose to get out, and they get out quicker. Now, socially, this is all bad news. And the welfare impact of lower R's is, in a way, obvious on savers, lower interest rates, lower returns to saving. But also, it can be the case that the lower interest rate can be bad for the utility of the entrepreneurs, the engineers as well. In other words, everybody, all these domestic agents suffer with lower interest rates. We've got a question mark here because we haven't filled in that box yet. Just a brief mention of some extensions. This model is kind of aching for some individual uncertainty. At the moment, it's a very deterministic model, except for the, well, obviously the MIT shock, which came out of the blue, but also it's except for the fact that, remember, any one domestic agent is switching backwards and forwards between being an engineer on the one hand and a saver on the other. But if we were to introduce some heterogeneity in either, say, the initial Z, or you could have idiosyncratic shocks to the Cobb-Douglas production function, then this dichotomy between exiting and saving becomes somewhat more muddy, but it's still the case that there can be an absorbing state. We've done the work on this now. There can be an absorbing state for low values of Z, where they definitely get out, even if they have a sequence of good luck from then on in. And then there's another absorbing state high up, where if their level of quality has gone up to that high level, they will certainly never get out, despite the fact that everybody's facing idiosyncratic shocks. There's an application, we think, to the housing market. People who are buying houses face two kinds of constraint. One is a loan to value constraint, and another is the loan to income constraint. Young people typically face the second constraint. And in a world with lower interest rates, where house prices have shot up a lot, but incomes perhaps haven't as much, then the loan to income constraint can be more binding. In other words, low interest rates, I think this is something which we all understand, low interest rates can crowd young borrowers out of the housing market. All right, I think that's what I wanted to say. The thing I perhaps didn't give enough time to was this mixed region, where if you take a photograph of the economy, you see these firms or plants which are diverging. Some are growing in quality or productivity, some are shrinking and ultimately getting out. The speed with which they get out is slow. It's like a slow death. Grealish has talked about this as living under the shadow of death. So individual plant productivities could fall in anticipation of, using my earlier numerical example of 20. So I know, let's say that I'm going to get out in 20 periods time, but on the other hand, I have started off with a nice quality level of 1. So I just simply milk that for 19 periods before I get out. So that's me living under the shadow of death. But of course, my contribution to aggregate productivity is not great. Nobu, is there anything, are you still there, Nobu? Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, it is fine.
I'm not sure what the etiquette is in one of these Zoom keynote lecture occasions.
No, I mean.
Do I say goodbye, everybody? Nice to see you.
No, let me just briefly take over. I think we are slightly over time, but I think it's obviously in a low interest rate environment where, at least also on our side, looking at from a macro perspective, we are very interesting also in kind of firm dynamics and wonder what will be the future. I think there should still be the possibility of raising we can collect a few questions if you are available in order to conclude. So if there are any questions, please feel free to take the floor or post them on the chat.
I'd rather you took the floor.
I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so John, if the industrial organization of this world is one where what the EMAs would like to do is to issue shares of some kind, organize co-ops, and buy their plans for themselves, because they can get a higher return to their expertise if they work in-house, isn't it? So wouldn't you expect that low interest rate environments would call to some different articulation of how firms are organized, how production is organized?
I'm not sure I'm going to do justice to that. So let me just give my tuppence worth and then I'll switch over to Nobu. The critical departure from Arrow de Breu is that EMA cannot promise not to demand the competitive wage rate ex post. So imagine the conversation taking place between Emma and me as a saver on Thursday at that ex ante moment of initial investment. Emma's kind of rather schizophrenic. On the one hand, in order to expand her investment as high as she could push it, she'd like to promise to me that from Friday, Saturday onwards, she'll promise to work for me for lower than the wage rate. So her Thursday self is terribly concerned to make a promise to work for lower than W subsequently. But she and I both know that that's not credible. There's a literature on this, began with paper by Franklin Allen and Rob Townsend, and a famous paper by Cole and Kochulakota, and it's called the inability to exclude yourself from the market. I think it has a more
non-exclusivity constraint.
The non-exclusivity constraint. Now, in this model, what that is Emma on Thursday cannot promise John that on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, she won't go off and work for somebody else. Even though on Thursday, she very much wants to. I mean, she would love to promise me to work at less than the going rate, because that way I would lend her more and she'd be able to have a bigger investment. So that's the departure from Arrow de Breu. I'm almost certain I'm not answering your question, Victor. So let me hand over to Nobu and see if he wants to have a go at it.
We haven't solved the planner's problem with this non-exclusivity constraint yet, actually. And but the non-exclusivity constraint is a source of this financial friction in our model. And most likely, if you have this kind of price enter into the constraint, there is a pecuniary externality, and the government may be able to influence the ex-post wage rate or something, and which change the financing constraint. But in terms of currently we have is to put this non-exclusivity constraint. Basically, the EMA cannot commit to work less than competitive wage because of she has an opportunity to do that without getting penalty.
Okay.
Can I have a short?
Yes, please, Ramon, go ahead. Final question.
Just a short clarification and small remark. The clarification is to make sure I understand. A great paper, first of all. But on the one hand, you have this decision whether you terminate at one point or not. But on the other hand, you have these shifting lives. At one point, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm employed or not. I thought it was going to be an interplay of these things. Or should I think that even if changes hands, the strategy is always kept, which then is a little difficult to tell when they're playing mixed strategies.
Yes, I was very short of time, so I did deliberately skip over.
Oh, and the remark is, you did a great job in explaining the nominator and denominator. In the old times, we were taking derivatives to do that, you know.
So we shouldn't call it the denominator, we should call it the derivative. Is that? It's not Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't appear in a movie called. Anyway, so the joke wouldn't have been. Anyway, I've forgotten what your first point was.
About the.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah, the one thing I didn't say, I was short of time and I skipped over it deliberately, was that when Emma, through that that Markov process, switches category and becomes a saver, she, of course, at that point has a bunch of tools on her hands. And we suppose that there is a market for secondhand tools where she can sell the tools to another guy who is an entrepreneur or staying on as an entrepreneur and will teach him or her how to use them. Now, that's the skill to teach is inalienably Emma's. What she would like to do on Thursday is to teach me how to teach. And then I would be able to, she'd be able to thereby collateralize the tools and borrow even more on Thursday. So that's, in a way, getting close to the heart of the departure from Arrow to Brewer. There are certain things, certain skills that cannot be committed to. And one of them in this model is this skill to teach. Nobu, is it?
Yeah, that's correct. Did we answer your question, Ramon?
Yeah. But then this is relevant when you do the value estimations at the end.
Well, no, it is relevant, of course. Absolutely. I'm so sorry. Yeah, when we do these value estimations, and I showed you this 9-way graph, in particular, looking at these discounted utilities, to be very clear about it, this is the discounted utility of a typical, look at the superscript, a typical Emma engineer at the point at which the MIT shock hits. So this is looking at the discounted sum of future utilities along the transition path, taking into account everything, including what you're driving at, which is the fact that this Emma might not be an Emma in 5 periods' time, and she'll have to sell her plant. So all of that is put into, I think we've done it properly, in other words. This is the real discounted value of the transition path.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Has been a fascinating presentation. I think the issues to raise are very fundamental, as many other issues that were raised today, on how we think about low interest rates, how we think about monetary fiscal interaction. So thanks to all of you for participating today. I think I cannot close today's session also without, from our side, thanking not only Ramon for his great work in helping to put this together, but also the local organizers, and that's Dara on my team and Christos on the university team have done quite some work. And since this is COVID time, they actually did this with a contingency plan. So you know that first it was planned to be here physically, and then we changed plans and made it virtually. But so they did quite a lot of work, and I really want to thank them for all of that. So a great first day. Thank you to you for the keynote speech. And I would then conclude for today. I don't know whether there's any announcement that Christos or Ramon wants to make for tomorrow. Please.
Everything is fine.
Yeah, that's fine. Then adjourn for today. Have all a good evening, a good day, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.